In the summer of 1974, Della Rouse, 58 years old and 2 years a widow, counted out 60 soft $2 bills at the Cadiz stockyard for 60 molting Muscovy ducks that not one other soul in the pens would raise a hand to bid on. And then she loaded them into the bed of her late husband's truck and drove them home and turned them loose into his tobacco like she meant. To lose the farm on purpose. The men leaning on the rail of the stockyard had a name for her before the truck was even cold. They called her the Duck Widow, and they laughed about it for 2 full summers, right up until the morning the hornworms came down on the Green River bottoms in a plague no living man in Trigg County had ever seen. And every clean-sprayed field for 30 miles was chewed to naked stalk and midrib in under a week. Every field but hers. What those ducks had done, walking her rows at first light all summer long, was written in pencil in a dead woman's hand in a book nobody but Della had bothered to open. She was not a large woman. She was lean and dry and burned brown as a fence post, with a flat straw hat gone soft at the brim and a sweat-black band around the crown. And she wore a dead man's brogans laced tight over 2 pairs of socks because her own feet had never grown to feel them. Her hands were the first thing a stranger noticed and the last thing they forgot, large-knuckled, seamed. The tobacco gum worked so deep into the creases that no amount of lye ever brought them white again. Those hands had topped and suckered and housed tobacco on that same bottomland for 40 years, first as a girl beside her mother, then as a young wife beside the man she buried, and now alone. She walked with the slow, rolling, sure-footed gait of somebody who had spent a lifetime crossing plowed ground before dawn and never once turned an ankle. When she stood at a row's head and looked down it, she did not see a crop. She saw a ledger of the whole year, every debt and every hope, standing up grain in the sun. You have to understand what everybody knew in that county in that year to understand why they laughed. Everybody knew that burley tobacco was a sprayed crop. Everybody knew you fought the worm and the beetle and the flea with a tank on your back and a bandana over your mouth, and that the man who sprayed cleanest and earliest brought the best leaf to the warehouse floor in November. Everybody knew that a duck was a nuisance in a truck patch and a disaster in a tobacco field, that it would foul the water and pack the ground and eat nothing a farmer wanted eaten. It was not ignorance that made them laugh. It was the opposite. It was the confidence of men who had done a thing one way their whole lives and watched it work, and who could not imagine that a widow with a straw hat and a book had seen a thing they had not. That is the cruelest kind of certainty, and also the most common, and there's one of these stories in nearly every county in this country, if you know to look for it. If you have ever watched a whole community decide that a steady, capable person had simply lost her mind, and had to stand there and hold your tongue because they were your neighbors and your kin, and you had to live beside them until you died, then you already know something about the 2 years Della Rouse spent as a punchline, and you already understand why a channel like this one exists. So, stay with her. Stay clear through to the morning. The sky itself seemed to move. Because the thing she knew, the thing not one of those laughing men had the patience to sit down and read, was already there, waiting, closed up in oilcloth on the corner of her kitchen table. The book had belonged to her husband's mother, a woman who had come across the ocean as a girl from a hard, cold farming country, and who had died the winter before Della's own husband did. She had been a silent, upright, iron-spined old woman who spoke a soft, broken English her whole life and kept her real thoughts in a language her daughter-in-law never learned. But she had kept a book. It was a stockman's memorandum book sewn by hand, the covers wrapped in a square of green oilcloth gone brittle at the folds, and its pages were dense with a small slanting pencil hand, some of it in English, most of it in the old country's tongue. For years it had sat in a drawer with the buttons in the twine, and Della had thought of it, when she thought of it at all, as a dead woman's grocery lists. It was the winter she buried her husband, sitting alone at the kitchen table with the wind working at the window sash and the coffee going cold in the cup, that she opened the book all the way for the first time. She could not read the old tongue. But there were numbers, and there were little drawings, and there were words a person could puzzle at. And one line near the back, underscored twice, with a pencil pressed so hard it had nearly torn the page, gave up its meaning to her slow and complete one night in February. Beside a small, careful drawing of a bird in the old country spelling were 4 words, and under them, in a labored English the old woman must have written for exactly this reason, for someone exactly like Della, sat the plain translation, 5 plain words in a shaking hand. The ducks eat the worms. That was all it said. She sat with that a long time. Della was never a fanciful woman and did not take it as a sign or a message from the grave. She took it as a fact set down by somebody who had known things, plain, the way a fact is set down. And she remembered dimly from her own girlhood an old man 3 farms over who had let geese into a bean patch and been mocked for it and grown the only beans that stood the year the beetles came. She began that winter to read the rest of the book the only way she could, by the numbers and the drawings, and to write her own English notes in the margins beside the old woman's hand. So that the book had 2 women in it now, 40 years apart, keeping the same account. There was more in the book than the one line, once she learned to read it by the drawings. There were small sketches of the bird at different seasons, and beside them tallies, and a drawing of a leaf with the underside marked, and a row of little dots along it that Della came to understand were eggs, and an arrow from the bird to the dots. There was a note in the labored English that said the birds must go out at first light and not at noon, and another that said they must be moved and never left to sour a patch, and another, near the very back, that said only, "Do not lose heart, they will laugh at you first." That last line she read many times that winter. She did not know whether the old woman had written it about the ducks or about her whole silent immigrant life. A girl set down in a strange country among people who found her ways foreign and her English funny. But Della took it to heart either way, and it steadied her more than Scripture some nights, that a dead woman she had never quite warmed to had reached 40 years across a kitchen table, and told her plainly they will laugh at you first. By the time the frost came out of the ground, she had decided she would spend almost nothing, because she had almost nothing, and she would put ducks in the tobacco, and she would let the whole county laugh. The morning she bought them, the pens at the stockyard were full of the culls and the leftovers, the stock nobody with sense wanted going into summer. There was a lot of 60 Muscovy ducks, half of them in the ragged, ugly molt that breed goes through, their faces already growing the red warty caruncle that makes a grown Muscovy look like something dreamed up rather than hatched. The auctioneer could not raise a bid. Men who would fight over a good heifer stood with their hands in their pockets and grinned. When Della lifted her hand, a low laugh went around the rail, and the auctioneer, not unkindly, called out asking what a woman wanted with a truckload of buzzard-faced ducks, and she said, plain and clear so it carried, that she had her reasons. And that was the last full sentence anybody there heard her offer in her own defense for 2 years. She paid her $2 a head. She drove them home at 40 miles an hour, which was 15 under the posted limit, with the ducks muttering and shifting in the bed the whole way. The daily work of it was the part nobody saw, and the part that mattered. A Muscovy is not a loud bird, not a quacker. It hisses, and it pumps its head, and it goes about its business with a strange, grave dignity, and it is, above all things, an eater of insects. Della learned her flock's habits as closely as she had once learned her babies. She learned that they woke and moved at the very first gray of dawn, before the dew burned off, which was exactly the hour the tobacco hornworm and the little green fruit worm and the flea beetle sat fat and slow and low on the underside of the leaf. So she walked them. Every morning, before the light was good enough to see color by, she went down the rows in her dead man's brogans with a peeled hickory switch, not to strike them, but to steer them. And the 60 ducks went ahead of her down the green tunnels of the tobacco, and they ate. They ate the hornworm off the leaf before it grew to the length of a man's finger. They ate the moth's pale egg off the underside of the leaf before it ever hatched into a worm at all, which was the whole secret of it, though nobody understood that yet, least of all Della. They ate the beetle and the cutworm and the grub turned up by her hoe. They pressed the ground less than a man's boot, and they found nothing, because she moved them on. She learned to read the flock like a gauge. When the ducks in a certain row lingered and worked hard and gabbled, that row was under attack, and she marked it in the old woman's book. When they crossed a row, bored and quick, that ground was clean. By the end of that first June, her tobacco stood broad-leafed and dark and whole, with hardly a chew-hole in it, and she had not carried a spray tank one single time, and she wrote that down too, in her own hand, in English, in the margin beside 4 penciled words in a language she would never learn to speak. There is a thing that happens to a body doing hard work alone in the dark, and it is not romantic, and the story owes it to her to say so plainly. She was up every day before 4. She walked those rows in wet grass, with the chiggers rising and the dew soaking her to the knee, and by the time the town men were pouring their first coffee, she had already put in what most of them called a morning's work. And then she came back to the house and did the rest of a farm's chores with nobody to help and nobody to spell her and nobody in that whole county to tell her she had not lost her mind. She kept a running count in the green book of every worm the flock cleared and every leaf that came through clean, and the numbers climbed all summer, and the numbers were the only company she had that did not laugh. Some nights she was too tired to climb the stairs and slept in the chair by the cold stove with a book open on her lap. She did it anyway. She did it because the leaf was answering her, quietly, in the only language a crop speaks, which is growth. And a woman who has topped tobacco for 40 years can read that language in the dark by feel. The men saw the ducks and not the tobacco. That is worth saying twice, because it is the whole shape of the thing. They drove past her lane and saw a widow woman herding 60 ugly ducks through a tobacco field at daybreak like a soul that had come untethered from its senses. And they did not once stop the truck, get out, and walk a row to look at her leaf. Down at the feed store in town, where the men gathered mornings around the cold stove out of habit even in summer, the duck widow became a standing joke. a thing to warm a slow morning with. Somebody would ask if anybody seen the Duck Widow's Navy lately, and somebody would answer that she was fixing to march it on the county courthouse, and the laugh would go around. Easy and mean and comfortable, a laugh loosed by a room full of men who were all a little bit afraid of the same things and glad to have found somebody to be surer than. Chief among them was a neighbor named Boyd Tanner, and his part in it was quieter and worse than the laughing. Boyd Tanner did not laugh much. He was a patient, tidy, forward-looking man with the best sprayed tobacco in the bottoms and a way of talking about his neighbor's land as though it were merely paperwork that had not yet come to him. He had been buying bottom land for years, a piece here at a tax sale, a piece there from a widow or a worn-out old man, always at the low price and always with a handshake that felt like a kindness while it was happening. He had looked at Della's bottom for a long time. It was good ground, riverside, and level, and it lay against his own like a missing tooth in a jaw, and he had made it plain in the soft, roundabout way of such men, that when she finally saw sense and gave it up, he stood ready to take it off her hands and save her the trouble of the auction. He did not laugh at the ducks. He counted them, and he waited, because a man who wants your land is patient in a way a man who only wants a laugh is not. His wife was named Ruth, and Ruth Tanner was the conscience of that whole side of the river, though she carried it quietly. She had grown up 2 farms from Della and had stood up with her at her wedding 40 years gone, and she did not like what was happening. And it troubled her to see the still, patient, waiting look that came into her husband's face when Della's name came up at their own supper table. More than once that first year she set a plate down harder than she meant to and said his given name, just the one word, Boyd, in a tone that made him look up from his food. He never answered it, but he heard it. A marriage is a long account, too, and Ruth Tanner was keeping hers. By the second summer the joke had gone stale even to the men who told it. And that is when a thing gets dangerous, because a stale cruelty needs a fresh push to keep it alive. The push came from the county extension office. The extension man who covered that end of the county was a young fellow named Pruitt, new to the region. University-trained, earnest, and utterly certain, and he had heard about the ducks, and he did not think it was funny. He thought it was a bad example. He came out one morning in a clean truck and stood at the edge of her field with a clipboard and watched her walk the flock, and he asked her a great many questions in a patient, correcting voice. And she answered the ones worth answering and let the rest fall. He wrote a note in his file, and then he wrote it up in the little mimeographed county bulletin that went out to every farm on the route, a paragraph without her name in it, but that everybody knew was her, calling the practice of loosing poultry in a cash crop unscientific, unsanitary, and a hazard to the region's standards, and recommending that no farmer follow the example being set on a certain river bottom. That paragraph did more damage than 2 years of laughing. Laughing you can outlast. A thing in print from the government with a young, educated man's certainty behind it that has teeth. That was the season everything nearly came apart, and it is the part of the story that would have been hardest to watch if you had loved her. The rains came wrong that July, a week of hard, drenching storms that turned the bottoms to soup and scattered her flock and drowned 4 of the 60 in a flooded row before she could pen the rest. The tobacco market prices came in soft that fall on the early leaf, and Boyd Tanner, reading the weather and the bulletin and the widow both, chose that low week to walk over, hat in hand, kind as a doctor, with a folded paper in his coat pocket and an offer on it that was fair enough to be an insult, and he sat at her kitchen table where the oilcloth book lay closed in its corner. And he told her, gently, that there was no shame in it, that nobody would think the less of her, that she had done more than any woman ought to have to do alone, and that he would carry the back taxes himself as part of the price so she would not have to face the courthouse. And Della Rouse, 59 years old at fall, tired to the bone, one crop from the bank. With a young man from the government in print calling her a hazard and her own church half embarrassed to sit near her, came the closest she ever came in her life to picking up his pen. She did not pick it up. She told him she would think on it, and she showed him to the door, and she stood a long while at the window watching his tidy truck go back up the lane. And then she did the only thing she knew how to do. She did not pray for a sign, though she was a praying woman. She sat down at the table, and she opened the green book, and she read by lamplight the numbers and the drawings and the two women's hands, and she wrote in the margin, in her own English, the count of her flock as it stood, and the date, and one line under it that Ruth Tanner would read years later and never forget, because Della showed it to her once and only once. And in the morning, before the light was good, she laced her husband's heavy brogans over 2 pairs of socks and took up the hickory switch and walked her 56 remaining ducks down the wet rows one more dawn, because the worms did not care about the bulletin. And neither, in the end, did she. Now here is the thing not one of those men had counted, walking around under the surface of that whole green summer while they warmed themselves at the cold stove with their joke. The moth had been laying, all through the wet, warm end of that second summer, up and down the green river bottoms. In every clean sprayed field where nothing walked the rows at dawn to eat the pale eggs off the leaf, the tobacco hornworm moth had been laying its eggs in a number no man with a sprayer had thought to count, because the spray killed the worm you could see and left the egg you could not, and the season had been just warm enough and just wet enough and just long enough for a generation to build on. A generation until the bottoms were carrying a load of coming worms like a struck match carries fire. Every field but one. In the one field where 60 and then 56 ducks had walked every single dawn since April, eating the egg before it was ever a worm, there was almost nothing left to hatch. Something was building in Trigg County that summer that not one man with a tank on his back had thought to reckon. And it was building everywhere the ducks did not walk. It came in the last week of August, and those who saw it never afterward found the words for it that satisfied them, so they mostly stopped trying. It began as a sound. In the still hour after a hot dawn out on the bottoms, there rose a soft, ceaseless, dry, whispering sound, low and everywhere at once, like rain that was not falling, like a great slow fire that gave off no heat. It was the sound of a plague of tobacco hornworms feeding, more of them at once than the oldest man on the river had words for, a soft, ceaseless working of a million jaws in the green dark under the leaves. And it did not stop. It went on through that day and that night and into the next, and where it passed it left the fields changed. A man would walk out at first light to a field that had stood shoulder high and broad and dark green the evening before, and find it going gray and skeletal before his eyes, the great leaves reduced to lace, and then to bare rib, and then to a naked standing stalk, the whole year's work and money and hope stripped to nothing in the time it takes to lose faith. Clean field after clean field, the best sprayed leaf in the county worst of all, because the spray had killed everything but the thing that was coming. 30 miles of it. Boyd Tanner's showplace bottom went in a day and a half, and on the far side of Boyd Tanner's ruined fence line, where his own dead gray stripped stalks stood rattling in the wind, there was tobacco. Standing, broad-leafed, whole, dark green, head-heavy tobacco, an unbroken sea of it running down to the river, the only whole tobacco for 30 miles in any direction. Because the ducks had eaten the eggs. Because there had been almost nothing in that one field to hatch when the plague came, and what little did hatch found 60 birds waiting at dawn who had been doing this one thing every morning since spring. The men who had laughed for 2 summers stood at their own fences that week and looked across at the duck widow's field, and not one of them was laughing. And the sound they heard when they stood there was the soft, dry whisper of 1,000,000 jaws finishing off everything they owned, and under it, from across the fence, the low grave gabble of 60 ducks going down a green row at dawn, eating. There is no scene in this story where Della Rouse walks into the feed store and stands by the cold stove and tells those men what they can do with their sprayers. She did not have it in her, and she would not have thought it worth the breath. She was seen that week only in her own field, walking her rows at dawn as she had every dawn for 2 years, in the worn brogans and the soft straw hat, and if there was anything different in her face, it was not triumph. It was tiredness, and something quieter and older than triumph, the look of a woman who has been proven right about a thing that cost her 2 years of being a joke and 4 drowned ducks and 1 night with a stranger's pen in reach, and who is too worn and too honest to pretend the being proven right gave her back the 2 years. She let the field speak. It spoke to 30 miles of ruin, and it did not need her help. The first one to cross the fence was not a mocker. It was Boyd Tanner's own grown son, a young man of maybe 22, named Wendell, who had said nothing at the cold stove either way, being young and outranked, and who came down the lane on foot on a gray morning that first week of September while the whole bottom still whispered with the dying of it. And he stood at Della's fence with his hat held against his chest in both hands and waited for her to come up the road to him. When she reached the fence, he did not know at first how to begin. Then he found it. "Mrs. Rouse," he said, "my father didn't send me. He doesn't know I'm here." He turned the hat once in his hands. "I want to know how you did it. I want you to teach me the ducks." She looked at him a long moment over the top rail, this boy whose father had sat at her table with a folded offer in his pocket and called her ground a kindness he was ready to do her. She did not make him pay for it. She never made anyone pay. "Come through the gate, then," she said. "You cannot learn ducks from the wrong side of a fence. And take your hat off your chest and put it on your head. The sun is coming." He came through the gate. She walked him down a row while the light came up, and she showed him how the flock read the leaf, how they lingered where the worm was and hurried where it wasn't, and she talked to him not as you talk to a neighbor's boy, but as you talk to somebody who is asked to be taught, which is the highest respect a working person can pay another. And he listened, and that was the first crack in 2 years of laughing, and once a wall like that cracks it, does not hold. Boyd Tanner himself came the next week. He came in his truck and parked in the lane and walked out to where she was, and this time he had no paper in his coat and no offer in his mouth, and it took him a while to say the thing he had come to say, because it was not a thing that came easy to a man like him. "I was wrong, Della," he he said at last, looking out over her whole green field and then down at his own boots. I was wrong about the ducks. I was wrong for 2 years. And I said things, and I sent a paper around, and I sat at your table and offered to take your ground, and I was wrong the whole time. He was quiet a moment. Ruth told me I would have to come and say it to your face, and she was right, and here I am saying it. I don't guess sorry buys back a crop. No, Della said. It doesn't. And then, because she was not a cruel woman, and because Ruth Tanner had stood up with her at her wedding 40 years before, she added, but you can buy ducks in the spring, same as anybody. There's no patent on it. My husband's mother didn't hold one, and neither do I. That spring, the extension man came back too, the young fellow named Pruitt who had put her in print as a hazard, and he did not come with a clipboard to correct her. He came to learn, and he had the grace to be plainly ashamed, and he asked if the university's entomology station might send men out through the season to count and measure and record what her flock did, because they had lost 30 miles of leaf and had begun at last to understand that the widow's field was the one piece of the puzzle that it held. She let them come. She let them count all that summer, and she let them read the drawings in the old green book, though not take it, and by the fall they had written her river bottom up as a cooperator plot in a paper with a long dull title, and they gave the widow's folk Trickett's real and scientific name, which was Integrated Biological Pest Control. And they set it down that the practice on a certain Trigg County bottom had held a field whole through the worst hornworm year in 40 seasons. The paragraph that had called her a hazard was quietly forgotten. The paragraph that named her field the county's living proof was not. And here is the part those men who had warmed themselves at that joke had the hardest time swallowing. And the part that mattered most to Della, and it is the reason a story like this is worth telling slow. When the county held its first field day on integrated pest control the following year, the notice for it went up on the board at the feed store in town, tacked to the very same wall where those men had gathered around the cold stove and made a 2-year joke of a widow and her navy of buzzard-faced ducks. Farmers came from 3 counties. They walked her rows behind her at dawn, 30 and 40 of them, hats in their hands, watching 60 and then more than 60 ducks go down the shaded green rows of the tobacco, eating the worm off the leaf. And they asked to be taught, and she taught them, standing at the end of a row in the dead man's brogans and the soft straw hat. An old woman now. Explaining a thing a dead old woman from a hard, cold country had known and written down in pencil 40 years before any of them were grown. Ruth Tanner stood with her that morning, the two of them at the end of a row, 40 years of friendship between them and one hard patch that had healed as a broken bone heals, stronger at the break. Della showed her, once, the line she had written in the margin of the green book that low night when the offer sat unsigned on the oilcloth, and Ruth read it and did not say anything for a while. You could have signed it, Ruth said finally. That night. He told me he was sure you would sign it. I nearly did, Della said. I want you to know that. I am not going to stand here in my good whole field and tell you I was never afraid. I had his pen in reach, and my hand was tired. She looked down the row where the ducks were working. But the worms didn't care what the government wrote, and they didn't care what those men said at the store, and the book didn't care either. The book just told me the truth, and the truth kept being true whether one soul in this county believed it or not. So I got up in the dark, and I walked the rows one more time. That's all it was. one more dawn than I felt like I had in me. She did not tell it as wisdom, and she did not tell it as triumph. She told it as you tell a fact you have set down in a book, plain, for someone who might need it later. The old woman from the hard, cold country got her name at last, too. When the university men made their record, Della saw to it that the source was set down straight, that the method had not come from her, that she had only had the patience to read it, and that it had come across an ocean in the head of a silent, upright woman, and then sat 40 years in a drawer with the buttons and the twine. In a hand-sewn book wrapped in green oilcloth, in 4 penciled words in a language nobody in Trigg County could read. The ducks eat the worms. They wrote her name into the paper as the origin of the practice on that bottom. An old immigrant woman most of the county had never known was anything but old. And so a woman who had died silent and half mocked herself was written, 40 years on, into a permanent and public record as somebody who had known a true thing. That was the whole of the vindication, and it was enough. Not the ruined fields across the fence. That, the next spring, and this is the picture to hold, it was not Della who walked the flock down the first gray rows. It was a neighbor's daughter, a girl of maybe 16, who had begged to be taught. Moving down the green tunnels in the dawn ahead of 60 ducks with a peeled hickory switch, learning to read the leaf while Della watched from the end of the row with her hands, those seemed large knuckle tobacco-stained hands resting on the top rail. The green book sat open on the kitchen table with a third woman's hand starting up in its margins now, the account still being kept. 40 years, and then some of it 3 women deep. The ducks went down the rows, eating the worm off the leaf, as they had every dawn since a widow spent $62 bills on the stock nobody else would bid on. And the men who had laughed were, by then, mostly running ducks of their own. If you have made it this far into an old woman's story about $62 ducks and a book in a language she never learned, then you are the kind of person this channel is for, and I think you already know it. So drop into the comments and tell us, was there someone in your own family, a mother, a grandfather, an old aunt, who kept a stubborn old method everybody told them to give up? And were they proven right in the end, or are you still waiting on the year that proves them? Tell us their name and the county they worked, so it gets set down somewhere. And if these slow, true stories of the people who were laughed at and proven right are the kind you want more of, then follow along and stay with us. Because there is one of these stories in nearly every county in this country, and we are working our way, patiently, one dawn at a time, through as many of them as we can find.